Welcome to Content Disrupted, bold takes on brand marketing. I'm your host, Dan Baptiste, and together we'll explore what it takes to excel in brand marketing at one of the most exciting and disruptive times in industry history. Okay, welcome to Content Disrupted, bold takes on brand marketing. Joining us today is Jessica McCarthy, Chief Marketing Officer and Vice President of Marketing, PR, and Communications at CARE New England. Jessica is an established voice within the healthcare industry, in addition to being an adjunct professor at Salve Regina University, a serial volunteer in the Rhode Island community, and an overall fascinating person. So, Jessica, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Happy to be here.
You know, as you think about this journey from research and sciences and marketing and even like product alignment, chief revenue officer, chief marketing officer, you've kind of worked your way through all of these different paths in one experience, which is pretty unique. Can you talk to us about that journey and kind of what you learned along the way?
You kind of pick up bits and pieces and little nuggets from every client that you work with, every industry that you're in. And I think, the key to sort of being an expert in something and really building your own personal brand is to understand how you can uniquely bring those bits and pieces together in a way that can help other people and help them with whatever it is they're trying to accomplish out in society, right? So I think, if you think about things like, I was really into the sciences. I when I went to college, I was in a lab every day, and that was my jam. But there I learned things like A/B testing that I use today, or how to think a little bit more scientifically, how to understand data and the science behind what we're trying to accomplish. So I think, that for me very clearly leads into sort of that marketing and growth marketing and brand marketing work.
Yeah, as you look at your peers in marketing, or as people maybe approach topics and areas differently, has anything surprised you in your background or really changed your perspective that feels unique or different compared to how other people think about the space?
So having worked, with these amazing military spouses and worked with organizations while I was a military spouse, everything was remote. And you had to work so much harder when everyone else was not remote, right? So now that there is sort of this flexibility and people in general across the globe are learning how to work better and more collaboratively in a remote environment, I think that's really benefited sort of the marketing, branding, PR world. Because unlike, someone who maybe is a nurse at a hospital that has to be there hands-on, we can really learn from each other and, become even more of an expert in our craft. Kind of like you and I are talking right now. We're not sitting next to each other, but we can learn from each other, and we can listen to a podcast, or we can, whatever the case may be. So I think that sort of strikes me as something that, was in my past that was sort of unique and beneficial.
Yeah, and a lot of folks struggle with that today, as we're thinking about culture and burnout and managing remote upskilling talent. What are some things you had a head start on that you learned that you applied, as the world went remote or hybrid, that you can point to as part of that military spouse experience?
I think, a lot of times we hear people say things like work-life balance, or, how do you do all of these things? And it's almost sort of like, it just is my life, right? It just, if you're doing it right. So I think just understanding that you can get an awful lot done, and many people function better actually by themselves in a focused setting. And then you bring people together for those bigger, let's say, branding activities, like briefings and brainstorming. And, how are we going to get to a new and innovative place? Typically, even something like an innovation session, you want people to think through those things on their own first. Because if they come, net new, you're probably just going to get sort of this group think, and everybody's going to go with the person that they think that you favor in the audience, right? So I think that there's just a lot of structure around sort of being as productive as possible and having processes in place that kind of fit throughout your lifestyle.
Does your neuroscience background help with this perspective at all? Because I feel like as you're thinking about how people think and behave, challenging different types and styles of environments, like did you go all the way there with the science? Is that useful as you think about team culture and structure and how you bring people together?
I think understanding the differences, but also the similarities in how people think and behave. For the most part, when we think about branding and marketing, um, people have similar reactions for the most part if they're in a similar group. It's a brain behavior, right? So just sort of understanding the brain and learning about the brain and all of that knowledge from back then, it wasn't a waste to learn all of that. And I still like to keep track of it today. I still like to read those dorky journals and things like that. Not that everyone's a dork, but I am.
I think that's a positive word these days. I think it's one of those words that have been reclaimed, right? Um, at least that's what I tell myself. So as we think, kind of shift gears a little bit to today's climate, so much has changed, right? And even how we behave, how we react to things, how we think about branding. If we lean into that sort of brand building side and how we connect with people emotionally and how you're thinking about things like positioning overall. I'd love to hear your perspective for today, and if that has changed based on all the things in the world that have changed, or if your position has been pretty consistent.
I believe the perception of brand building has changed because the perception is that anybody who wants to be an influencer can be an influencer and build a brand. But I don't believe that that is the reality. I think if you actually look at, and so there are some really successful influencers who are truly growing brands, they're working really hard, right? So in my mind, I like to actually wrote an article. I like to liken it to sort of a magician, right? If you have everybody thinks that they can do magic tricks, right? You can get a magic kit off of whatever store or website you want to get your kit from, and you can get it and you can do a little magic trick. Just like anybody can build a little brand on their own personal social media platform, right? You can build your personal brand, let's say on LinkedIn, and you can do that. But that to me is that amateur level equivalent of getting the little magic set off of Amazon. If you go and you talk to a professional magician who is doing these crazy levitation mind reading tricks, that is more the equivalent of professional marketers and brand builders, right? We have a lot more tricks up our sleeves. We have a lot of experience, and we can tell you what's going to work more of the time. So if everybody's just trying to be an influencer, it's not going to work most of the time. But if you want to build a true brand, we can tell you as professional marketers how to do that, and it will be successful most of the time. But I don't believe that that reality and that process and the science behind that has actually changed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. I think the toolkit certainly has, but a lot of the process, even with our own clients, I find it's almost like a Back to the Future where you're borrowing these principles, and in my mind, what I've seen is a whole bunch of chasing tactics, which has gotten ourselves away from these big market shaping principles. Like, how do we want to move together and create an ownership lane, not how do I like get my email marketing working, and how do I chase a position on TikTok, or should I, is it going away, like you get so overwhelmed and distracted at the tactics that you lose sight of the big picture, which I think is what you're saying here, which is great. So speaking of tactics and approaches, you kind of hinted at it in your answer, but I know you have a pretty unique position on personal branding and how that ladders up to a larger brand position at what you referred to as like the professional level, not the amateur level. Can you break that down and help me understand it? And then I've got a million, maybe a zillion follow-up questions after that on, how it works and all that.
Yeah, so I think we have sort of accidentally created a world where everyone thinks they're a professional marketer, right? And I think similar to how maybe a magician feels offended when everybody tries to do a card trick, right? I think a lot of marketers feel a little offended when a business or a business partner or someone who's trying to create a brand comes to them and says, "Hey, how do I do this on TikTok?" Right? Or how do I do this on whatever ABCD platform, right?
Don't you love that?
But these are tactics, right? So what we need to think about is what is the focused message? What is that single most important problem that you are solving for society? And that needs to become the story of your brand, because everyone, every business is a million things to a million people, right? So I think we really need to focus in on what problem are we solving for society, or what great advice can we give, what can we focus on, and that is what should be the basis of our brand, be that a personal brand or a business brand. And some businesses like to call it a mission, a vision, your values should all back up your brand, but really it is, what is that key thing that you're providing?
You're speaking my language. I've been on this soapbox so hard, you have no idea. And I love that answer. One of the ways we think about this is, how do you almost like decode this? Because to your point, you could be in planning sessions with 15 people for 8 weeks and not get the right answer. We found like a couple of hacks, and I'd love to hear your perspective. But almost, as you look at the value in value creation, there's really kind of two key steps to start that we look at. One is if somebody leveraged your services in full to the best of their ability, what would their life look like? And not just like how would they use your products and services, but like how have you changed society or populations through your services? And you start to paint this almost future state.
Yeah, so I totally agree with everything you said. And I think what I would sort of add to that in one sentence would be, typically the businesses that are most difficult to work with are the ones that don't have a firm grasp on their own strategy. They don't have a stated strategy of what they're actually trying to accomplish, to your point, in people's lives. And I do, I am a professor in a couple places, and something that I like to talk about a lot is Clayton Christensen's Jobs to Be Done. And the moral of the story there is, what are you actually creating that will benefit someone's life, right? So an example is American Girl doll, right? So that's a key example that he uses. And how are they selling these really expensive dolls when you can go to the dollar store and get something way cheaper and it's the same thing? You walk that pony down the road and you're spending this money because in your mind you're creating an experience. You're creating an experience. You're creating more happiness for a child through that experience, and you're building a relationship with the child. It's not about a doll. So things like that are what we want to get to. We want to keep asking the question, why, right? People want to reach for whatever it is you're trying to sell them.
Yeah, love that. As you're educating America's youth, or the youth of the world, I don't know. I don't know what Salve Regina's population, how global it is. Are you seeing folks take and adapt that message differently than you would have if as you went through school? Like is the perception changed, or is the perception still the same? And it's just kind of reminding people, like, are there population dynamics in play here as we think about the next wave of people in business?
I think we all know that marketing has become much more digital, and so too has our population. So too has our youth, right? These kids are just, they're native, right? They're native to the digital space. So I do think it's a benefit to marketing to have that base understanding already. But I do think there is a little bit of that. Well, how do I become a TikTok? That's the first question that I get in every class. And, I teach at two different universities, two like fairly, different groups of kids. And it's always the same thing. So I think, we really, our job as brand marketers and sort of, I would call us sort of stewards of true branding, is to make sure that we're not mixing up tactics with strategy and brand process.
How do you help people make that leap, or in this case, students, or maybe some tactic focused business leaders, if you were speaking in that style of community? Like, what are some of the tools you use to say, okay, I hear what you're trying to say, but here's the real thing we need to be thinking about, but these two things aren't unrelated. Like, how do you help kind of navigate that?
For me, it's a lot of, I like to just say, well, walk the pony down the road, right? So you want to do TikTok, great. What's your strategy? Right? Just the fact that, okay, you want to create a TikTok channel and it's going to be all about you. What's your strategy? So maybe even just talk to me about a content strategy, and we'll start there. What are you going to talk about and why? And why do people care? Right? So that's sort of, it's sort of these baby steps. So sometimes we have to work backwards from, okay, you're pushing a tactic on me here. You really want to be a TikTok influencer. So here are some metrics of what you're going to have to hit to gain this, right? This is your goal or your desired outcome is you want 1 million followers interacting with your content. What is that content going to be? There's a content strategy. You've already defined your channel strategy. You want that to be TikTok. Content strategy. All of that has to ladder back to your brand strategy. And that needs to ladder back to your highest level brand messaging. So when it's proposed in such a way, I do think we have to actually start with people wherever they are, right? If they're like, I want to be a TikTok influencer and that's all that's running through their mind, you're not going to just jump to, hold on, I have to like channel Clayton Christensen. I have to ask you why 5 times. Like they're not going to make that leap. But I think they can kind of see the holes in their thought process if you walk them back step by step to get there.
Love that. So as you're thinking about also like bridging that gap, if we think of how digital has expanded, when you and I graduated, the world was simple, right? You had a handful of tactics and channels, a small handful, and then fragmented to now you're distributed across websites, social, email. If you're doing media, that's fragmented further. And I think what gets lost in that sea of all kinds of different people doing individual tasks for individual channels is laddering up to purpose, to then take a step back, to look up and then come down with consistent messages for audiences and channels. Are you seeing that as well? And, how do you help kind of accomplish that from a positioning standpoint? Like, what are some of the key principles?
Yeah, so that's a really great point. I think there are, as you mentioned, so many channels and tactics, but I do find, as I'm sure you find as well, the audiences are pretty segmented, right? Like the dinosaurs like us might still be on Facebook, right? And that might be a really great way to target us. But these kids that I'm talking to at colleges, they're not on Facebook. Facebook's for old people, right? So if I'm talking about trying to get someone to get a colonoscopy or a mammogram, I'm going to Facebook. If I'm going to get somebody to buy a new pair of Nikes, I'm not, right? So I think there are, based on what your brand is and what you're trying to promote, there are channels that you're just going to take out of the equation, right? There's no way I'm talking about, mammograms on TikTok right now. It's just not something that would be beneficial, right? So I think we can eliminate some tactics right off the bat. And then we can also sort of figure out through A/B testing. Let's go back to my science days. We can do a lot of testing on all of the channels. So if we're questioning, which messaging or which version of messaging might work better on a certain channel, we test that. We do it all the time. Even if it's just for a couple weeks of, let's say, organic social, we kind of gauge what the reactions are to this copy versus that copy. But it does always have to ladder back to that single brand message, that single brand strategy. So we can't be confused about that.
And how do you tie those things together? Like we've built what we call our atomization engine, which we're using both tools, methodology, and some emerging technology to take big messages and then version it for audience channels, et cetera. But I'm curious on, as you think about a multi-channel, multi-media type of approach to bringing a brand position to life, how do you do that effectively? And are there some key learnings that you've had if you have been successful with it?
Yeah, so I think we strategically use things like keyword searches and things like that. We want to make sure that we're using the right words in the right places. We also try to really keep up on social trends. What words are the kids using these days that maybe we didn't use back in our time, right? So depending on who we're targeting, either we're going to talk to our teenage children or we're going to, see what word was put into the Oxford Dictionary last year, things like that. So I think words matter, right? To answer your question, I think we take that overall brand strategy and then we want to make sure that we're using words that are applicable to each audience. in order to get that singular message across.
The word in my house recently has been cringe, and I'm
Oh,
usually the recipient of it. So yeah,
aw,
it's a sad
sorry.
story. It is a sad story. Two emerging teenage girls. That's my life. So
Well, maybe we can talk later about your personal brand in your house. We could work on that
I need
together.
some help. That sounds
Yep.
amazing, and
I have two teenage daughters too, so maybe I can.
I would value that quite a bit. When you, I'm sure as you're, kind of wearing your professor hat, you're looking and hunting around for examples of either brands or individuals that are doing this really well. Can you share any examples that kind of come to mind as you think about, hey, what does an A plus look like for doing this the right way?
So, I believe right now in our socio-political type of environment, a brand that stands out to me based on your question is Patagonia because they are consumables, obviously, right? So you can go and buy a really expensive winter coat from them, but they are closed. So their employees don't have to work on days like Black Friday. You can buy things online. They're also encouraging you to recycle. So I can't remember the name of the program, but things like that, that where there is a really huge element of what used to be called corporate social responsibility, but that started to feel really clunky. I actually believe CSR needs a rebrand. I'll raise my hand for that if anybody wants to do that with me, but corporate social responsibility just feels like something that like your grandfather created in a boardroom of white dudes. Like, so we need to take that and like even bring the branding of that into today's language.
I want to dig into that because the way you explained it, one, I've also been super kind of dialed into how, as a business, do you leave the world a better place, and how do you return that as part of your purpose, and what space do you occupy? I always thought that people were rewarding businesses that have shared belief. But as you're talking, I'm wondering, is it almost a form of, hey, it's like the same sense of volunteering, but I'm doing it through purchases. So I don't feel bad about spending the money or upgrading my gear or whatever it is. So it's almost like a currency you get for people who are doing good in the world. And then for me, that makes me feel good. Like, am I thinking about that right? And
I believe you are, right? So think about any time. So I was at an event last night and this wonderful gentleman got an award for his volunteerism. And he said, I'm going to say what everyone always says, but it's true. I got so much more out of this than the soup kitchen did, right? But it's true because you are gaining this sort of personal capital, whether that's in yourself, if you do it in a silo and you don't tell anyone, it makes you feel good about yourself. Or if other people know you do it, maybe you also get some sort of tangential good feeling and goodwill off of that. I do believe that brands can really succeed in this arena by, I don't want to say utilizing influencers because I don't know about that because I don't want to go to a tactic, but utilizing sort of the persona that is building in our college age, soon to be our largest consumer group. That's why I think we talk about this sort of college age, getting their first jobs. Within the next 10 years, this is going to be our largest consumer group. So this is what brands of things like consumables should be paying attention to.
do you also see this as a way to compete for talent that you want to have work with you or for you? Like, as you're thinking about, hey, why would somebody work here? Part of it is our platform or position. Like, are you seeing that as a valid outcome? And then where else do you see the benefits beyond, like purchase behavior?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of talk right now actually about what careers people are going into, right? And how can they help society? And I think, for example, nursing, right? We had huge nursing shortages, but people don't necessarily all want to be nurses anymore because they were so overworked during COVID and everything else. So there are people want to help people with what they're doing. And it seems like that used to be a really small pie, right, of what you could be. or what you could
You
do.
had to choose, right? Do I work for a charity or do I, sell my soul, right?
I've read that the nonprofit world has grown significantly in the last 5 years. So people working for nonprofits, that pie is also growing, so that people can feel good about what they're doing, right? So people want to be involved in something that's meaningful. And, I think people are really taking a look at what they want to do and who they want to be, maybe a little more closely, because the information is a little more readily available than, take your kid to work day was sort of the only exposure I ever had, back in like the 90s. But now you can look online and see what anybody does on a day-to-day basis, really.
I think part of that, I would assume, is also as a culture and a society, we had a moment to breathe, and with the world shutting down and hybrid work, and then that gave us perspective, right? Like what's important, and how has my perspective changed? So I do agree, and the world happens to be on fire and falling apart. So there's all that happening, right? And as we're thinking about, hey, where do I want to play? What role do I want to have? And is this place going to exist for my kids in the way that it exists for me today? So I think all of this aligns to what you talked about, which is a rebranding of CSR. There's also been a bit of fatigue in that space too, because it's almost like everybody rushed. And I'm wondering if that fatigue has happened because brands came in and were saying things that they didn't follow through with, or they were too maybe like talking down to people. Like, what do you think some of that recipe has been? First, for an explosion in this style of communication and branding, and currently, like people getting more frustrated by it.
Yeah, so I think it all goes back to what is your what is your brand strategy and what is the purpose of your business, right? So I think what comes to mind for me is IKEA, right? So IKEA has this brand strategy of, everyone can have fine furnishings, fine like furnishings in their home, despite price point. But then from a CSR perspective, they're getting dinged because everybody's just throwing this furniture away, right? You get it, you're in college, you furnish everything, and then you leave college and you just put it on the side of the road and it's filling up some landfills. So I think we have to think about corporate social responsibility when we create our strategy for our business, right? I mean, if someone thought that through a little bit more, that people would be throwing these things away, sort of this fast fashion. Um, I think you look at, you can rent clothing, right? So all of these things are sort of, instead of just purchasing clothing all the time, you can rent clothing and then at the end of the month you send it back. So I think, yes, people, I agree with you that they're a little burnt out on corporate social responsibility in sort of that old, stodgy kind of a way. But I think now people are actually building their business, their new business strategy with that in mind. So maybe it won't need to be a thing anymore on its own because it'll just be embedded in what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think to go back to your previous example of Patagonia, one, they built a platform around protecting open spaces and oceans. They've looked all the way down through their manufacturing process to say, like, how do we, select fabric and handle production of material, even supporting legislature that, or introducing legislature that protects, national parks and things like that. So I think when done well, you feel like you're part of a community that is doing good by making a purchase, and is that how you're imagining this evolving? And you've said rebranding CSR. What are some of the other things that we should be thinking about as we think about the future of positioning and branding?
Yeah, so I think that Patagonia example is one of the few that I think have effectively, I would say, rebranded CSR because it doesn't feel fake. It feels like they really went all in. And I think that new companies will be able to start from that place, but companies that are already in existence need to really think through how they're going to rebrand their corporate social responsibility because it's harder for them, right? Because maybe they've just been producing and producing and producing consumables, that are being used up, or maybe they have harsh chemicals in them, or they're in the landfill, etc. I think it's actually a lot harder to rebrand what currently exists from a corporate social responsibility perspective than it is for this next generation building businesses where this is already ingrained in their minds.
As you're talking, I'm wondering if it's you kind of know who a business is that's been around for 10, 20, 30 years by the choices they've made, packaging. So you almost have to break that and rebuild it, I would imagine. It's a two-step, and maybe that's why there's been so much fatigue, is you just have people that are hopping on and, like maybe a Volkswagen that was manipulating emissions reports, and now they're like, oh, we're green and friendly, and you're like, hold up. And so for folks like that find themselves in what I would call like a baggage situation, what are the effective steps that you have to take in order to transition to a preferred position as we think about like a more socially responsible company?
I think they need to take a beat and do it right, right? So you need to take a minute and say, if you want to use Volkswagen as the example, what are we trying to solve for as Volkswagen, right? Are we trying to move people around, right? Giving people an ability to move around. What does that actually mean? And how do we do that in a way that will be responsible into the future? Um, I don't know what that would mean for them, but when you have something that's, say, a large manufacturer like a car manufacturer, there's, billions of dollars worth of equipment and all of that. So I understand from a business strategy perspective why it's so difficult to try to, I would say, think outside the box a little bit. But I think from a branding perspective, if we're strictly talking about wanting to be viewed as a responsible business, I think that will be required in the generations to come.
You talked about positioning. How many elements do you think you can effectively position around? So as a brand, if I'm saying, okay, well, we need to look at our branding and our positioning and who we are. Typically, that's going to manifest into like pillars or of a story or something like that. Do you have any like sense or a rule for how expansive or constricted that should be as you're thinking about positioning and brand building?
So I think the answer is ultimately one. You can only do one focus thing really well, but that one thing can be a little bit broad, however you want to define it. But if your one thing, if you have, products that fall outside of that one thing, just create a different brand for it, right? Create some sub brands or some subcategories, and you can still have, the portfolio that you need. But I think if you're trying to stretch one brand too far, then you're not going to be able to market that one brand effectively. You have to have focus.
I couldn't agree more. I think I wonder your response to this, which is a lot of marketers and marketing leaders are scared of that because they're like, oh well, crap. Like, what if I picked the wrong thing? And like we have to do these 57 things though. Like so. How do you talk to somebody that is nervous about centralizing a leadership position within a category that's really focused?
You need to ask them who's going to care about this multi-tool that you're trying to create, because most people don't care about a multi-tool that you're trying to create. Most people are just trying to solve a problem. And by problem, I don't necessarily mean, actually a problem, but they're trying to solve, I want to run faster, so I want to buy the, lightest shoes, whatever the case may be. So this is not how people behave. People do not behave by trying to buy the multi-tool in every brand situation.
Yes. So is there tools or tactics to move from that multi-tool to, let's say, a hammer or focusing people? Is it just continuing to elevate? Like, so, hey, you're operating 2 levels too low. And, if you ask why 5 times in each one of these, you're going to get to the mountaintop. Like, are there tactics like that you advise people on?
Yeah, and I think a lot of times you have to advise people to take yourself out of the current structure of your business. That's usually the barrier, is people have set up their business and operations in a specific way, and because of that, they don't want to think about their brands differently. So I would just say, you know, take a step back and think about what is actually the purpose of each one of these things. And maybe you have other brands or products within your portfolio that actually should sit with this group, right? So I think it's really important to just sit down and ask really everyone that's working on a product or a brand, not just your key stakeholders, because that oftentimes there's a skewed view there of how a leadership team might think that everybody wants everything that they have to offer, because of an earnings report or something like that. But when you actually break it down and you know, phone a friend or ask the audience or do some surveys, you can find out what people are actually looking for.
As you know, you can't walk out a door without hearing somebody ask about AI or talk about AI. What's your perspective on AI to aid in some of these goals as we think about shifting the focus of marketing and really being more dialed into a purpose-centric approach?
So I think AI is great, right? I think we have a lot of conspiracy theories about, AI taking over the world. It's just another tool in the toolbox. And I think the fact that, so really we've had AI for quite some time, right? If marketers know, AI has been around for a while, right? So if it's algorithms, and if something's popping up on your phone, people say to me all the time, it's so creepy. I looked at these, shoes online, and now they just keep popping up whenever I'm on my phone. And all of this algorithms, it's all AI related, right? And it's actually been around for a long time. And I think it's just another tool in the toolbox that we should welcome and we should use. And I think it's fantastic for things like writing content. Content gets stale pretty quickly. You can create your overall strategy, and then you need to, like we talked about previously, you might want to run that strategy and that framework across various channels and platforms, and AI can help you format that in a way that it would be most effective for that channel or that platform. And it can help you write the most effective copy. It can tell you things like whether you should use emojis in something or not. I mean, it really is helpful in the way that it's taking almost little bits of market research that we traditionally in the olden days would have spent weeks or months trying to understand, what's the most effective subject line for an email. Now AI can give me three examples and tell me how effective they might be. So for things like that, I think it's extremely effective.
Yeah, we've built an approach that we focus on creating less and getting more. And it almost forces your hand into this positioning exercise because it's like, okay, if we're creating four hero pieces, one a quarter, and we're getting 400 assets out of those that flow across channels and email. So it removes you from the tactic, but it forces you to reimagine your value, your why, your purpose in the world, and kind of craft those stories effectively. And that for me has been really liberating because we've been so low in these production cycles. You almost like you don't have the space or the mindset, or it's almost an impossible task to make. If I'm writing social copy, how does that individual social post ladder up to my position as a brand? You're like, oh God, like what a terrible exercise. And that's where we've been for the last 15 years, right? So now with AI, you can like really kind of craft a marketing position in our mind if you spend time with the story, right? What are the big stories we need to tell? How does that ladder up to our purpose? And can I AI AI scale? And I think for marketers, the impact of that will be massive because if you're a creative led marketer or you're an aspirational marketer, as you mentioned, um, you haven't been able to play that role because you're stretched so thin and you're just chasing deadline after deadline after deadline. So now, if you're focused on the story versus the lower level production, um, everybody wins, right? Like, so it starts to change the skill sets and the composition of teams and how content is connected and how, to your point, it's adapted using best-in-class formulas, like how should this show up? Should I use emojis? What should my email cadence look like? All of that stuff. And by the way, like, can I finally personalize things and stop talking about personalizing things? So that's been pretty exciting for us as we look at where the future's headed. As long as we don't get overrun by AI overlords. If so, and they're listening, I'm very compliant and I will do whatever you say.
I could be a robot for all you know.
You could. I mean, given this history, yeah, or you could build a robot for sure. I know that.
But I do think what you said about social media and how, back in our day, we used to be up at 2:00 in the morning writing social copy. To me, that's going to be the new, like, I used to have to walk to school both ways uphill in the snow, So like, I'm glad to see that go.
Yeah, I think everybody will be. Once they get over the fear of like, oh God, do I not have a job anymore? It's like, no, just like use your brain more, like I think you're really talented. So like, how can we reposition you into something that's more valuable and scalable? I'm sad we're running out of time here. So I have what we refer to as the speed round of questions as we close out here. First thing that comes to mind, and here we go. You ready?
I feel like that we're entering like an ink blot test. And there's going to be some kind of like AI analysis on my performance.
As a marketer, what keeps you up at night?
As a marketer, what keeps me up at night is my team. People that work with me and for me. I want to make sure that they are engaged and that they are enjoying what they do, and that they're enjoying what they do with me on my team. I like to build a really fantastic team, and that's important to me. So if I think that someone is not, totally in it, I want to know why. So that's what would keep me up at night.
There's going to be a whole second episode just on that, but we'll keep going. What keeps you going?
What keeps me going in this business is my excitement around all of the marketing and PR type of tools and tricks and hacks and new things to learn, because marketing is everywhere. And I do not believe that businesses can thrive without marketing.
Amen. What marketing term do you love?
Cookies.
Because you like to eat them, or because yes, perfect. And what marketing term do you hate? And don't say not cookies.
What term do I hate? This is a tough one. I don't hate any of them. There has to be one. Give me a second. Hold on. I knew this was going to be hard. It might be influencer.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. No, there's nothing to apologize for. Influencers. And speaking of emojis, what emoji describes the current state of marketing?
The one that's like, ah!
And then last one, quality or quantity?
Quality.
This has been a real pleasure. Thanks for joining. Thanks for sharing your immense experience with us and with the world.
Sounds great, Dan. Have a good one. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Content Disrupted, brought to you by Skyward. To stay up to date on the latest ideas and insights in brand building and content marketing, visit our website at skyward.com. That's skyword.com. Join us for our next episode, where we'll continue to challenge marketing norms and inspire you with fresh strategies for growing business through brand storytelling.